Boldwood presents The Peculiar Incident at Thistlewick House, written by Jenni Keer and read by Lucy Scott. Chapter 1. Thistlewick Tye, Norfolk, 1895. "Did she survive the night?" Barnabas asked, his face etched with concern and his lack of sleep apparent from the smudges of grey beneath his red-rimmed eyes. He'd anxiously grabbed at his housekeeper's sleeve and was bracing himself for her reply, having stumbled from his bed when he'd heard footsteps on the landing. The thought that his beloved Emma might have left him alone in this world and passed over to the next was unbearable. She was his everything. His wife's fever had been raging out of control the previous day, her breathing laboured, her speech incoherent, and her skin positively afire. Dr. Appleby had expressed grave concern at her racing pulse, and then shaken his head, almost imperceptibly, and let her limp wrist drop back down onto the silk quilt. He'd asked Mrs. Drayton to make up some further mustard plasters and apply regular cold compresses to bring down her temperature. But everyone suspected these ministrations were futile, because, when the doctor finally took Barnabas to one side, he informed him the outcome was now in God's hands. Barnabas studied his housekeeper's face, frantically looking for an answer to the question before she could articulate her response. "She's still with us, sir. Praise God. The fever's abated and she's out of immediate danger, but then I must go to her at once." Relief flooded through every molecule of his being, and he sidestepped the older lady and hastened down the hall. "But I must warn you, sir, that she's not quite herself." Her voice followed him into the bedroom, where he found Emma, on top of the covers, wrestling with their housemaid. "I want my mummy," his wife wailed, clawing at the young girl who was valiantly trying to tuck her back into bed. "Emma, sweetheart." He rushed to her side. "You're confused. Your mother passed 5 years ago." The housemaid took a step back, and he perched gingerly on the edge of the bed, reaching for his beloved's hand. She immediately snatched it from him and shuffled her body backwards, a look of pure terror in her eyes. "Go away, strange man! Everybody go away!" Didn't she recognize him? An uncomfortable feeling swirled in his stomach. And then she began to cry like he'd never seen her cry before, launching herself face down and drumming her fists into the bed, a sudden outburst that resembled the despair of a child. "She's been asking for a Zella." Mrs. Drayton was behind him now, "and talking of sleeping in a wagon. It simply doesn't make sense, sir." There was a knock at the open door as Dr. Appleby alerted them to his arrival and stepped into the room. Barnabas stood up, walked over to greet him, and they shook hands. "Your man, right. Let me in. He tells me the patient has improved considerably overnight." "The fever's gone, doctor," the housekeeper confirmed. "In fact, rather miraculously, most of her symptoms have disappeared, but her mind's awfully muddled." Emma was still wailing into the bedcovers, managing to get a few words out between sobs. "Dying hurt! I didn't like being dead!" "My darling, you're going to make a full recovery. It will just take time." Barnabas tried to soothe her. Perhaps it had felt like dying to her, as she'd been awfully close to death. "Mrs. Shaw." The doctor approached her and placed his medicine bag on the floor. He took his pocket watch from his waistcoat and reached for her wrist. But she jerked herself upright and slapped his hand away. "Call me properly!" she screamed, tears still cascading down her pink cheeks. "Call me Sphere, and to make my legs go short again." Emma paused for a moment, then narrowed her eyes. She grabbed the doctor's outstretched arm and sank her teeth into the crisp white shirt, and consequently the flesh beneath. He cursed and jerked his arm from her grasp. It was a totally unprovoked assault. Barnabas started to panic and looked to the good doctor for reassurance. "What's going on? I've never seen my wife so much as swat a fly. Where's this anger come from? Is it a result of the delirium?" Before the doctor had a chance to answer, Emma turned to her husband and shouted at the top of her lungs, which seemed much stronger than when she'd been wheezing helplessly the day before. "My daddy'll get his big gun and make them dead, like I'll make you dead." She jumped from the bed, skirted past the doctor and ran at her husband, her arms flying as she repeatedly pounded him with her balled fists, time and time again. He managed to pull her close, trying to calm her, but she changed tactic and began to kick out. He'd never known anything like it in their 10 years of marriage. This was not how his gentle, unassuming wife behaved. Had the fever left her confused? Had she suffered some kind of damage to the brain? "It's all right, I've got you," he reassured her, as Dr. Appleby rummaged in his medicine bag and pulled out a small red leather-bound box containing his morphine paraphernalia. The gentlemen exchanged a glance to confirm they both understood what was needed. Barnabas held her tight as the doctor deftly slipped the needle into her arm, and the effects were almost immediate. Emma stopped fighting her husband, and he felt her body go limp. After a minute or two, she slumped down and, between them, they manhandled her back into bed. "Let her rest a while, and I'll drop by again this afternoon." The doctor hastily checked her pulse as he spoke and then packed up his bag. "I'm running late today. Unfortunately, influenza is now rife in the village. I've just been to Low Farm, as their children are showing signs. Both are listless, with dry coughs, and we know Mrs. Shaw was with them last week, helping at the Sunday school." "I think the kitchen maid has it too," the housekeeper volunteered. "I've confined her to bed for the moment." Dr. Appleby sighed. "I'm to have a busy few weeks ahead of me, then." He nodded his leave as a slurred mumble came from the bed. "Want my sister! Want Zella!" But Emma had no sister, and the name Zella meant nothing to Barnabas. As a man who'd always been open to things outside the realms of rational understanding, he contemplated an alternative explanation, because the life she was talking of was not hers. Sleeping in wagons and strange names that didn't sound English. Could it be his wife had been possessed of some troubled spirit when she'd been at her most vulnerable? He'd long since believed in the supernatural and attended many a séance before moving to Thistlewick Tye, repeatedly witnessing the dead successfully communicate through those with a spiritual gift. But was it possible for one such to enter the body of a living person? Emma had spoken of dying, of her legs being too long, as though she didn't recognize her own body, of family members that didn't exist. He desperately hoped her behavior was a temporary aberration, but he also knew if this state of affairs continued, and if his suspicions were correct, there was only one course of action open to him. He headed for the staircase with a heavy heart, because that would mean contacting someone from his past, someone who hadn't spoken to him for 10 years, someone who had every reason to hate him. "We'll have to start without the doctor," Lord Felthorpe said, half a mile away in Felthorpe Hall. "There's much to discuss today, and I want it all tied up before I leave for my appointment in Norwich this afternoon. Ideally, I'd like to give the builder the go-ahead this morning for the repairs to that little row of workers' cottages near the forge. The bad weather will soon be upon us, and the elderly couple in the end terrace need to be dry and warm, or I fear they'll not live to see the new year. Did you have any business, Reverend?" Only 2 of the 3 members of the Thistlewick Tye Benevolent Committee were present for the weekly meeting. Dr. Appleby had failed to appear. Reverend Fallow shuffled a pile of papers before him and peered at his notes. "Old Frank has begged that he be allowed another week to find his rent, and the schoolteacher is hoping we can secure the funds to send the Hockley lad to the local grammar school. He shows such promise, but his parents don't have 2 beans to rub together." Lord Felthorpe nodded. "Of course, and they're such a lovely family, always at church on a Sunday, and often give of their time to help out their neighbours." At that moment, the door of Lord Felthorpe's study opened, and Dr. Appleby belatedly entered. His forehead was furrowed in confusion, and his cheeks pale, as he hurried to take his seat next to the vicar at the large pedestal desk. "1,000 apologies for my tardiness, but I've just come from tending to Mrs. Shaw at Thistlewick House, where I've witnessed the most peculiar—" incident. Chapter 2. London, 1895. Dark green velvet curtains were drawn across the high sash windows of Edward Blackmore's modest West London dining room, and a fat beeswax candle flickered on the mantelpiece, giving off a slightly sweet aroma. An oil lamp, with a decorative claret-coloured glass shade, stood in the centre of the circular table, and was turned down low. In the middle of the sideboard there was a human skull carved from plaster, smooth and symmetrical, with 2 further candles either side. The room was silent, save a wooden mantel clock, which gave a disconcerting heartbeat to the gathering. The seated and carefully vetted guests, alternating male and female, were a collection of particularly wealthy and highly respected individuals. They'd all been greeted with a large, sweet sherry half an hour previously, and given the opportunity to mingle, before being instructed to take a seat and create an unbroken circle. 10 pairs of hands were linked together across the deep red chenille tablecloth, and the air was heavy with expectation. Edward instructed them to take slow, steady breaths and think of the person that they wished to communicate with, to picture their face and try to recall the sound of their voice, their touch, their scent. He smiled to himself as he studied the shadowed faces before him. This was his favourite part of the evening. The anxious, grief-stricken people from earlier were now more at ease, helped by the alcohol, as they recalled their fondest memories of the departed. They were already connecting with the person they so dearly missed, if they did but know it, and he often wished it were enough that people understood the ones we love never truly leave us whilst we still hold them in our hearts. But those left behind invariably want more, and this refusal to let the dead go had practically evolved into a religion of its own, with spiritualists now offering their services all over the country. Edward Blackmore was somewhat of a novelty, because the majority of these mediums were women. It was widely accepted that their sex was of a more caring and sensitive nature, enabling them to better channel messages between this world and the next. But he'd always been a gentle soul, right from childhood. Even now his jet-black shoulder-length hair, extraordinary ice-blue eyes and bone-white skin made him look fragile, even if some of his clients whispered behind his back that he looked more like a spirit than any picture book illustration they'd ever seen. His perceived fragility, however, was offset by his flamboyant clothes. He often sported a coloured silk top hat, wore long, flowing overcoats, and loved a gaudy, patterned waistcoat. He always carried with him an elegant walking cane with the most extraordinary carved ivory skull handle. It had 2 red crystals staring from the eye sockets, and he occasionally waved it at irritating children when they came too near. Had he been born 100 years previously, he would have been labelled a dandy. But it was all about the misdirection. He got to decide what aspect of his person onlookers focused on, and his elaborate attire was part of the act. He cleared his throat, tilted his head back, and closed his eyes. "Beloved spirits, we welcome you with open hearts and minds. Move freely amongst us and speak to me, so that I may pass on your messages to those gathered here tonight." There was a prolonged silence, and, as the clock counted out the seconds, 9 hopeful faces searched the shapes in the shadows. Someone let out a stifled gasp as the candles either side of the skull extinguished themselves. "No rappings, eh?" said one gentleman, who was somewhat of a sceptic, but was there to support his distraught wife. "I thought your lot got the spirits to play tambourines and ring bells." Edward opened his eyes and smiled, his blue eyes bright even though the room was gloomy, and answered in a low and steady voice, "I see you've been influenced by the amateur dramatics of the charlatans. How can a spirit that has no form, no substance, knock against something, move a physical object, or play an accordion? It is, of course, nonsense. They are an ethereal mist, a mass of emotional energy, the very essence of a person. That is what calls upon us this evening and sweeps about the living, hoping to connect with those they have left behind.
"Spirits with unfinished business," volunteered Mrs. Wellington Smith, a particularly fervent believer.
"Exactly that, dear lady. And we have 2 such restless souls here with us tonight. Can you not sense them?" There had been a gradual drop in temperature since the séance began, but it was now quite noticeable. The older woman to his left shivered slightly as the curtain fabric gave the smallest ripple, even though both windows in the room were firmly closed. She raised her eyes to meet Edward's, and he could see her expression was full of hope. He wanted nothing more than to ease the burden of her suffering, and drew in a slow breath, focusing so hard that he could feel the stirrings of a headache. "Our first visitor is the one spirit that I was hoping would not appear, and he wishes to talk with Lady Temple."
"It's Alfred, isn't it?"
Her voice was shaky and low.
"I know he's here. I can smell his cologne."
And it was true. The sweet but spicy scent of bay rum aftershave lotion filled the air. No one questioned how a mass of thought and emotional energy that couldn't rap on a table might be able to generate such a fragrance, or even snuff out a candle. Edward didn't answer her question. He didn't need to. Everyone knew that her husband, Sir Alfred Temple, an explorer of some note, hadn't been heard of for 7 months now. He'd gone missing somewhere in the Himalayan mountains of Tibet, where he'd been surveying previously uncharted areas. Accompanied by 3 other men, he'd fallen desperately ill and become separated from his party after crossing the Karakoram Pass. Everyone but his wife had accepted the sad truth.
"I was so sure he was still alive, convincing myself that I'd have felt something had he passed away."
Her voice cracked, but she didn't allow herself to cry.
"As much as it pains me to admit it, I was obviously wrong."
"He says he misses you, Nellie, and always will." Lady Temple turned to look at Edward.
"Then my husband really is here, because he was the only person allowed to call me that. Everyone else addresses me as Petronella."
It was further proof, not that she needed it, that Alfred was there in the room with them.
"Ask him what happened. Will I ever be able to bring his body home?"
There was silence around the table, save the occasional sniff from Lady Temple, who was struggling to keep her grief in check, unable to wipe her eyes or blow her nose without breaking the circle. Edward let out a long breath, knowing he was about to deliver some very unpalatable news. "Sir Alfred informs me that he was not of his right mind, delirious and confused, when he left the camp. He was walking for some hours, but missed his footing and tumbled down a ravine. It was a quick and painless death. He didn't suffer, but doubts anyone will find him in those treacherous mountains, and could not accurately direct anyone to his body if he tried. But he begs you not to grieve. He died doing the thing he loved. Besides, he insists that he's watching over you now, and bringing home his bones will do nothing to make him closer to you than he already is." Lady Temple nodded her understanding, her own eyes brimming with unshed tears.
"Tell him that I love him."
"Tell him yourself," Edward said gently. "He's behind you and says that he has a hand on your shoulder as we speak." There was a sense of reverence around the table as everyone respected the moment. "There's one more spirit desperate to make contact," he eventually continued, closing his eyes once more. "A man who tells me that he was driven to the edge through desperate circumstances. He's here tonight to beg forgiveness. Frederick? Does that name mean anything to anybody?"
"My father?"
Mr. Cardew, who'd arrived with the unconvinced but curious medic-turned-novelist, Dr. Doyle, was astonished by the possibility.
"But he died 30 years ago. I came here tonight merely as an observer, and a skeptical one at that. Surely it can't be him."
"I do not choose who seeks me out. I merely pass on their messages and try to ease the suffering of all concerned." Edward opened his eyes and looked directly at the man, his face full of pity. "Oh, my dear fellow, it was you who found him in the barn when you were a child." Even in the gloom, he could see the colour drain from Mr. Cardew's face.
"That's not common knowledge."
He looked at his fellow sitters.
"There's no way he could know that."
"Of course not,"
Mrs. Wellington-Smith chided. "Your father is here tonight speaking directly to Mr. Blackmore. Did you ever doubt that he was genuine?"
"Well, He's being pulled away from me now, but asks your forgiveness, both for the act itself and because it was you who stumbled across his body." "Of course I forgive him. Let his soul pass over and finally rest in peace." Edward nodded and closed his eyes for the final time. "We thank you, dear spirits, for coming to speak to us tonight. You may now leave us." The flames on the pair of sideboard candles suddenly reignited, even though no one was nearby, and the room grew a tiny bit brighter. The icy chill also dissipated as the temperature began to rise. After a minute or two, Edward instructed his guests to break the circle and return to the drawing-room where Delphine would serve nightcaps before the carriages arrived. One by one, they walked out into the hallway as Edward extinguished the candles with a small brass snuffer and turned up the oil lamp to better illuminate the space. The lingering smell of bay rum floated in the air, and he noticed Lady Temple lurking by the door. As he approached, she thrust a small bottle of notes towards him, but he shook his head and waved them away. "I don't do it for the money, madam. I do it because I must. From the moment I was aware that I could communicate with spirits, I knew I had to use my gift for good, even though it is both a blessing and a curse. It's my duty to be a mouthpiece for these troubled souls, and I will not exploit the misery of my fellow man." The very fact that his visitors were amongst the wealthiest people in London, and he made no attempt to overtly part them from their money, only proved to everyone how genuine he was.
"I don't think you realise, Mr. Blackmore, what it means to hear from my darling Alfred. The not knowing has been eating me up all these months, but I can finally move on. Such peace is worth more to me than a few pounds, and I won't take no for an answer."
Her stubborn determination was apparent from the set of her jaw. "And I refuse to take payment. There are far too many charlatans out there, making money from their parlour tricks and falsehoods. You can see I'm a man blessed with an adequate income. I drink fine wines, visit the best tailors, and regularly take in theatre shows. I've no wife, no dependents, and my inherited wealth is more than adequate for my needs. But if you insist, then the sum in its entirety will be forwarded to my pet charity, the Cattisham Orphanage Fund. It feels right to provide some comfort to those who have no one." She nodded, holding the money out to him again. He reluctantly pocketed the notes before they joined the others in the drawing-room for a parting drink. Edward stood in the corner with the two guests he'd not met before. Dr. Doyle was bemoaning his fictional detective creation, Sherlock Holmes, and relaying how his mother had begged him not to kill the character off. Mr. Cardew, an ardent fan, was just raising a glass to the woman's successful petition when Delphine, Edward's maid, entered the room holding a silver tray upon which sat a solitary letter.
"This has come in the last post, sir."
She bobbed an awkward curtsy.
"If you'll notice, it has urgent written across the top left-hand corner, underlined twice, or I'd not have interrupted."
Edward nodded, glanced at the mantel clock, and took the envelope, sliding his bone-handled letter opener under the flap. Who could it be from? Demand for his services was hardly pressing. The dead were in no hurry, after all. The looping and irregular writing in black ink was a hand he recognized, but one he didn't relish corresponding with. That funny way of finishing off the descenders with a curly flourish, and the ridiculously oversized capital letters. He took a pair of thin wire spectacles from his waistcoat pocket and moved to the large brass oil lamp on the corner desk. His eyesight had always been poor. It had hampered his learning as a child, and his slow progress had been one of the many reasons his father had caused to be disappointed in him. Edward could only be thankful that his tutor had finally realized it was defective vision holding him back, and not stupidity. Curious as to what his cousin Barnabas could possibly want from him, he began to scan the words. The man had taken everything from Edward years ago, and the pair had cut all ties, with limited communication between them over the intervening quarter of a century, and certainly never anything of an urgent nature. Thistlewick House, Norfolk, October the 16th, 1895. Edward, I know that you'll find it strange to hear from me again, but I need your help. How it must amuse you to find the boot so firmly on the other foot, but it's
Emma. And whatever your feelings remain towards me, I know that you cared for her once. She has recently been dangerously ill, and I genuinely thought I was going to lose her. But to everyone's amazement, even the physicians, she survived the worst of the fever, and for that I am truly thankful. However, since her recovery, her behaviour has caused much alarm. The doctor believes the fever has affected her brain in some way, but I know something darker is going on. She claims her name is Fear, and talks of things I know nothing about, yet her manner of speaking is childlike and rambling. Having listened to her wild assertions and deranged proclamations for the last 2 days, I've come to the conclusion that she's been possessed of some spirit. There is simply no other explanation, and whatever our past differences, I do know you to be the very best in this field. Whilst I appreciate that you have no reason to help me after what happened, please know that I can pay you handsomely. The things she is saying are truly alarming, and I'm fearful she will harm either herself or someone else. Please consider coming to Norfolk at your earliest possible convenience. Yours, Barnabas Shaw. Bad news? Mr. Cardew asked, noting the frown on Edward's face. Just a letter from someone I knew a long time ago. He shrugged. Nothing of importance. He placed the single sheet of cream paper back in the envelope and walked over to the hearth, where he let it slip from his fingers and into the crackling flames. He'd loved Emma once, even though their acquaintance had been brief, and had even been fond of Barnabas when they'd been younger. But there were some things a man could not forgive. His life no longer included either of them, and whatever trouble the man was in, he'd have to face it alone. How dare he try to manipulate his emotions? The tiny roar of flames devoured the letter in seconds. There. It was dealt with. The first of the carriages arrived, and Delphine began to ready the coats and gloves. 2 further gentlemen insisted on making discreet and extremely generous donations to the Cattisham orphanage before their departure, and Mr. Cardew took Edward's business card to pass on to a friend. So impressed was he by the events of that evening. "We wondered if you might like to visit our country residence this Christmas," Mrs. Wellington Smith inquired, as Delphine helped drape her fox fur stole about her shoulders. The dead, glassy eyes of the creature stared at Edward and made him feel uncomfortable. "I understand you have no family, and we have quite the gathering every December. Our Boxing Day hunt is one of the best in the county, and of course my daughter would so love it if you were to stay." "I'm not at ease in social situations, nor am I much of the outdoor sort. The invitation is kind, but I cannot accept." "Nonsense," Mrs. Wellington Smith replied. "I'll not take no for an answer." But Edward knew it would be wrong to let the woman believe he had any interest in her daughter, which they both knew was the real reason for the invitation. She was an attractive young girl with adequate flesh on her bones and a ready smile, and her promised dowry was even more appealing. But he couldn't marry her, any more than he'd been able to marry Emma. It was a burden he would carry with him always. Edward Blackmore would remain a bachelor until the end of his days, because to take a wife would mean revealing his secret, and he simply wasn't prepared to do that. Chapter 3. Edward couldn't get the letter out of his mind, even though all that remained of it was ash. How dare Barnabas contact him now, after all these years, purely because he wanted something? And yet his guilt at abandoning Emma in her hour of need weighed heavily on his shoulders. To the casual observer, Edward was doing well. He had sufficient wealth and was well respected in his field, even if it was a profession viewed as humbug by many, and even dangerous by some. But he was lacking the one thing that really mattered, and that was love. His mother had never been around to show it, his father had blatantly withheld it, and the one person who might have truly loved him, he'd rejected. It was what he desired above all else, and yet every time it was offered, he pushed it away, leaving many would-be brides and eager mothers unable to understand why, at 36, he refused to settle down. The disquiet he felt over ignoring his cousin's plea was added to when a second letter arrived later that week. The envelope had the same looping hand and curly flourishes,
and he had the same sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach as he read the words. Thistlewick House, Norfolk, October the 18th, 1895. Edward, 2 days have passed since I wrote to you, and I've heard nothing back. I don't blame you for your reticence to answer my plea, but now I'm all but on my knees, begging you to come to us as soon as humanly possible. The situation with Emma is becoming increasingly serious. She still maintains her name is Sphere and repeatedly claims that she wants to kill us all. Yesterday morning she even ran at our housekeeper with a table knife. This is a serious situation, and one I fervently believe only you can help me with. You always had a gift for communicating with the dead, Edward, and your reputation as one of the few genuine spiritualists out there has grown. I understand you have no reason to look upon me kindly, but if you won't do it for me, do it for her. I know you cared for her once. Is there not a part of you that would help alleviate her suffering? I beseech you. Name your price and I will meet it, for I have no need of fortune without my dearest Emma to share it with. You are our only hope. Barnabas. Edward adjusted his spectacles and walked over to the drawing-room window to read the letter a second time, rubbing at his clean-shaven chin in contemplation. There was a part of him that was almost gleeful to find his cousin in such a desperate situation. He could request a sizable sum be donated to the orphanage fund, enough to make the man truly suffer for stealing his birthright, because 17 years ago his cousin had done exactly that. When Jonah Shaw had died in the summer of 1878, and everyone had gathered to hear the reading of the will, Edward had every reason to expect that, as his only surviving child, he would inherit everything. He may not have been close to his father, but it hadn't been through the want of trying. An affectionate soul by nature, he'd spent his childhood surrounded by few people he could lavish his affections on. He'd adored his nanny, an elderly woman who had become a mother figure in the absence of his own. But she was no longer required when he turned 12, and so was dismissed. He had few playmates and was educated at home by a stern tutor, his father refusing to send him away to boarding school. His cousin, Barnabas, 5 years older than him, had been his only real friend, a boy who'd welcomed the opportunity to stay with his wealthy uncle and young cousin during the holidays. Jonah encouraged the friendship, even though he had little time for his own child and could barely even bring himself to look at him. Edward had long suspected his father thought of Barnabas as his own, but even so, at 19 years old, when he sat in the offices of Haycock and Smith, along with his extended family and a few valued members of the household staff, he was totally floored to hear that it was his cousin who would inherit the maltings business and their moderate country home, and not Jonah Shaw's disappointment of a son. Edward pulled out a map of England from a low shelf on the bookcase to his left, slid into a leather armchair, and studied the pages covering East Anglia. He knew his cousin had returned to the place of his wife's birth shortly after their marriage, because the Shaw family home had been sold by a desperate Barnabas, a further betrayal that Edward could not forgive. Emma had been an only child, set to inherit everything, including a large country house by the sea, and was able to bail her then-fiancé out of his desperate financial troubles. Edward had never been to Thistlewick Tye, but sure enough, there it was, a small village on the Norfolk coast, nestled between Cromer and Sheringham. He thought back fondly to the young woman who'd captured his heart all those years ago. She should have been his, but then so should his father's maltings business and the Shaw family home. But he'd never wished Emma ill, and so her condition worried him. Was there something he could do to help? The truth was, however, Edward no more had the power to expel a malevolent spirit than he could turn himself invisible. He was as much of a fraud as the next man, but played a better game. Because if there was one thing he understood, it was people. The mind was a powerful thing, and, unchecked, it could conjure up disturbing visions and destructive half-truths. Equally, with the right guidance, it could positively impact the health and well-being of an individual. Emma was clearly suffering from some kind of delirium as a result of her fever, but he could perhaps assist with her recovery. And if he could truly name his price, the Cattisham Orphanage Fund might also benefit. Perhaps it wouldn't take him an anticipated further 2 years to accrue sufficient funds for his plans. Now wouldn't that be something? Delphine entered the drawing room, carrying a small copper watering can, and headed over to the window. Edward relied on this young woman and her brother Carl for everything. They kept the house running and assisted with his spiritualist endeavours, as well as keeping his secrets. But their loyalty would only remain as long as he had sufficient funds to pay them. He was under no illusion that they cared for him. It was his purse they cared for. "If I were to stay in Norfolk for a few days, would you be able to manage here?" he asked, as she poked the thin spout into the dense foliage of an unwieldy fern.
"But you never go away, sir."
"It wouldn't be for long."
"But how would you—"
"I'd be staying with someone I knew from before. I could manage. He knows. He's always known." She nodded.
"You have a séance next week for the government minister and his wife."
"I'll be back by then. If I go. I've not yet decided." But the pull of seeing Emma again, and equally Barnabas's offer of payment, was getting stronger. The orphanage fund was not growing as quickly as he'd have liked, and it was a cause exceedingly close to his heart. For Edward Blackmore's mother had died in childbirth, and his father, who had always seen his son as somewhat of a disappointment, had died nearly 2 decades later. Although technically no longer a child at this point, he'd very much felt like an orphan at the tender age of 19. Because what Edward Blackmore failed to tell the benevolent donors to the Cattisham Orphanage Fund was that he was the founder, administrator, and sole beneficiary. Chapter 4. In the end, the decision was an easy one. Edward caught the morning train from Liverpool Street to Norwich Thorpe and changed lines to Cromer. He then procured a lift on a brewery wagon that was delivering kegs of beer to the Sailmaker's Arms in Thistlewick Tye to complete the last leg of his journey. It was an uncomfortable ride, sitting up the front next to the driver, but he was finally deposited in the village centre, with the old man advising him to take plenty of walks along the cliffs to get the full benefits of the fresh, salty, ozone-rich air, and to indulge in some winter sea bathing. Like most people, he'd taken one look at Edward and worried for his health. But it was not the season for brave dashes into the North Sea. There was a biting autumnal wind, and Edward turned up the collar on his emerald-green frock-coat as he stepped down from the wagon, collected his baggage, and donned his matching top hat. The cliff walks he might partake of if time allowed, but the sea bathing he most definitely would not. Edward took stock of his surroundings. He plunged the end of his walking cane into the soft turf of the large grassy area that stretched before him, but decided to stick to the meandering path, not wanting to soil his fine leather shoes. The orphanage fund looked after him well. The view was so delightfully green, but stippled this time of year with the emerging colours of earth and fire as the trees began to shed their leaves. He'd been led to believe that Norfolk was a flat county, but a high ridge of land was visible in the distance to the east. There was so much sky in this part of the world, whereas in London he had to force his head up to find it as he wove between the tall buildings and lofty plane trees. Here, Edward felt, the world went on forever, especially when he spun further to the left and got his first glimpse of the sea. A thick, dark line on the horizon divided the calm blue heavens above from the ever-moving grey waters below. His vision may not be sharp with regards to details, but the sense of space before him took his breath away. He approached the cliff edge, wary that there was a drop of perhaps 300 feet to the beach, and no effective barrier to prevent a fall. At one point, a post and rail fence had evidently run along the top, but it dipped and sagged where the land had dropped away, and sections of it were missing altogether. To his right, he could see a swathe of dead thistleheads, the spiky silhouettes of the stems visible against the sky. It would surely have been a blanket of purple splendour in the late summer, and clearly where the village had got its unusual name. He was about to pull back and head for his cousin's house, when he saw the small blur of a figure scuttling across the wide expanse of flat sand beneath the cliffs. Likely a woman, from the way she moved. She was wearing a heavy woolen hooded cloak, which obscured her face. Perhaps she sensed him, because she paused and tipped her head up to the cliff tops, before quickly dropping it back down and continuing along the shoreline. He turned away from the sea and towards the village. The driver had told him that Thistlewick House was at the end of Copperpenny Lane, and he soon found a weathered wooden sign for the correct road. He followed the sandy track for 1/4 of a mile until he saw a large, mid-century brick-and-flint house set in a sizable parcel of land. Emma's father had been a gentleman of independent means and had built the house upon his marriage. A square box of a building with, Edward guessed, perhaps 6 bedrooms. It was large enough for a well-to-do family and a handful of staff, but not as large as the Shaw family home that his cousin had inherited and subsequently lost to creditors. Edward pulled at the rope to sound the doorbell, which was promptly answered by the housekeeper, and gave his name. As he stepped into the hallway, Barnabas appeared from a doorway to the left. The man had gained weight, he noticed. Marital bliss had certainly led to him piling on the pounds, whereas Edward's loneliness had always kept him slim. The two men studied each other, and it took him a moment to notice the defeated posture and dark circles under his cousin's eyes. Barnabas dropped his gaze to the floor and turned to step back into the room he'd appeared from. "You're too damn late, Blackmore," he said over his shoulder. "She's dead." Relieved of his coat and travelling bag, Edward followed Barnabas into the drawing room and attempted to warm his hands in front of the open fire. His mind was racing. How could Emma be dead? She was such a force of nature and far too young to have passed away, somewhere in her 30s, like himself. He felt his stomach churn at this unexpected and devastating news. His cousin gestured for him to take a seat, lingering by the mantelpiece and sizing up Edward with accusatory eyes. His grief was visibly weighing his shoulders down, like an overcoat of iron. For the first few minutes, both men remained silent. All Edward could think about was her sweet face, how she'd looked at him back then, and how she'd made him feel. The knowledge that light had been extinguished was devastating. Finally, his cousin spoke. "I appreciate that you owe me nothing, and I had absolutely no right to ask anything of you, but I'd hoped the money might have been an enticement. We were both always driven by the pursuit of wealth as young men, and what with your father's unexpected legacy—" He couldn't finish the sentence, or perhaps decided it would be unwise to do so. Edward scowled. "I came for Emma, even though I admit the temptation to reclaim some of the money you stole from me was a factor. However, you must see from my clothes, and know, from what you read about me in the newspapers, that I have sufficient means. What you so cruelly took from me, I have accrued for myself." Barnabas shook his head. "Well, you didn't come soon enough. She's lying in a casket in the drawing room, stone cold and stiff. The clocks have been stopped, the mirrors covered. More important than ever, if there are indeed rogue spirits floating about. And my life is over. But then maybe that was always your plan. Leave it long enough for her to pass away and then arrive in time to gloat. You know I was fond of Emma. I'd not have wished her dead." Edward tried to hide his building emotions, horror at the revelation she was gone, anger at the subsequent accusation. Hadn't his father always said he was too sensitive? One of the many reasons he'd been such a disappointment to the man. "Tell me what happened." "Well, my letter's not clear enough. She was possessed by an evil spirit." "Details, man," Edward demanded, as his cousin tipped back his head and drew in a long and pained breath. "She visited a distant relative in Norwich 2 weeks ago, but quickly came down with influenza, which we have since discovered is rife in the city. The doctor prepared me for the unthinkable when the delirium was at its worst, not expecting her to last until morning. However, to everyone's surprise, she survived the night. Her health, if not her mind, was almost immediately improved, But she was a different person, childlike and confused. Childlike? She kept asking for her mother, even though the woman has been dead for 5 years. Her manner was aggressive, and she had fits of temper like an infant, biting people and kicking out. Then the fever must have affected her memory, and she'd simply regressed to her girlhood. It wasn't as simple as that. It wasn't her girlhood she was reliving. As I explained in my letter, she said her name was Esfir. The name isn't even English, for goodness sake. And then she began to carry around the doll that had sat idly on a chair in the bedroom for years. She actually screamed when she caught her reflection in the mirror at her dressing table, not even recognizing her own face. Edward frowned. Emma had always been practical and not one to display a fanciful imagination or behave in a dramatic manner. Look how calmly she had taken his refusal of her all those years ago. God damn it, man, she didn't know me or anything about our life together. She didn't recognize any of the staff and wouldn't let me touch her. Have you any idea what it feels like when your own wife pulls away from your embrace? There was an awkward pause. Barnabas must have suspected that Emma had been fond of Edward once, and he also knew the reasons that his cousin pursued a bachelor life. His comment had been thoughtless. The longer this strange behavior went on, the more I knew it wasn't Emma, he continued, but instead a girl from another time. Someone who stood in front of my wife's sewing machine and had absolutely no idea what it was for. Who talked of cooking over open fires and living amongst wagons. There was an uncontrollable anger within her that I've never witnessed in my wife, and she repeatedly cried that they must all die, although I never found out to whom she was referring. Simply put, it wasn't that Emma had lost her memories. It was that she had someone else's. Edward felt uncomfortable. She'd often teased him for his supposed gifts, unlike Barnabas, who'd always been so gullible, firmly believing his younger cousin could converse with the dead. It would have been no act on her part, but unlike his cousin, he didn't believe she'd been possessed. It was a ridiculous notion, and even though he couldn't be absolutely certain spirits didn't exist, he'd certainly never encountered one. To his mind, people simply found it too unpalatable to accept that everything ceased with your death, and the spiritualist movement had grown from this fear. But the existence of a soul separate to the physical body was scientifically doubtful. Most mediums he'd encountered were blatant frauds, like himself, although he had attended a couple of unnerving séances that he'd never satisfactorily explained. But if she recovered from the fever, even if she was confused and suffering from delusions, what caused her to pass away? Edward suddenly realized no explanation had been offered for her death. Hadn't his cousin indicated that she'd survived the worst of the fever? A relapse, perhaps? Barnabas slumped into the chair opposite his cousin, and it was obvious that talking about her final moments was difficult, as his voice began to crack. She was found yesterday morning with a syringe of morphia beside her on the bed covers. Dr. Appleby raised the alarm. I rushed in as soon as I heard the commotion and truly think it was the worst few moments of my entire existence, grabbing her limp hand and trying to rouse her. She looked so perfect, her pale pink cheeks and closed eyelids making it seem as though she were merely asleep. It was hard for Edward to watch as the tears streamed down his cousin's face. He couldn't summon up the satisfaction that he wanted to feel at seeing the man suffer. His grief was real and raw, and, had they not shared an uncomfortable past, he might even have reached across to put a comforting hand on his shoulder. Dr. Appleby could only conclude that her mind had been so deranged that she didn't know what she was doing. She must have accessed his medicine bag and stolen the box of morphia. We'd all witnessed him frantically searching for it the previous evening, only to assume that he'd left it at the surgery. So, Emma had decided to end it all. Perhaps she'd had enough about her to realize she was spiraling into madness and had taken the opportunity to avoid further suffering. How unbelievably tragic. A manservant entered with a tray of tea, but Barnabas looked across and waved him away.
Fetch us both a proper drink, right? My cousin is partial to absinthe, and ask the housekeeper to make up one of the guest rooms. If you could also tell cook there's a gentleman staying for dinner and to order more food in for next week, I'd appreciate it.
But Edward had arrived too late to save Emma, and his scheme to extract money from his cousin had been scuppered by her tragic death, so there was no reason for him to remain in Thistlewick Tye.
There's no need. I won't be staying more than one night. You're my cousin by an accident of birth, but we're not friends, Barnabas. You know that. Besides, as you so correctly pointed out, I'm too late.
There was no love lost between them, and it was only the severity of the situation that had forced Barnabas to call on him. So why would his cousin want to prolong the visit now that she'd passed away? He had no desire to remain at Thistlewick House longer than absolutely necessary, preferring to return to London to deal with his grief privately. His cousin's hands were clenched into tight fists, and there was a grim determination in the set of his jaw.
But I need answers, Edward. The spirits of both my wife and whoever possessed her surely remain in this house, and with your gift you can contact them.
He thumped at the arms of his high-backed chair with his palms.
Damn it, man, I'm begging you to get those answers for me. I need to talk to her again. I need to understand. I need to say goodbye.
Wright approached with the drinks on a tray. Barnabas swept up the brandy and took several large gulps, as Edward took a small sip of his favoured green spirit. It burned his throat, but helped to sharpen his thinking. Could he still extract some money from his cousin and make him pay for the past? Or would he get greater pleasure, a joy that you couldn't put a price on, by refusing? It would be payback for everything that had happened all those years ago.
I appreciate the offer of a bed for the night, but there is no sum of money that can undo your betrayal. I came to be of help to Emma, and I'm as broken as you are that she has gone, but I leave tomorrow.
Barnabas lurched forward.
This is exactly why I need you, why Emma needs you. There are things going on here that you don't understand. We must get to the truth, Edward. I have long suspected that there is an evil presence in Thistlewick Tye, spiritual or otherwise, and I don't have the strength or the skills to seek it out by myself.
Edward sighed.
She was lost to her own mind, Barnabas, and made the tragic decision to end her life. There is nothing I can do for her now that she has gone.
He felt sorry for the man, having to bear the shame that his wife had taken her own life, but Emma's delirium would make people more sympathetic.
I don't think you understand.
Barnabas leaned forward, staring at Edward with an intensity that made him uncomfortable.
The hastily arranged inquest this morning may have returned a verdict of suicide whilst of unsound mind, but I am absolutely convinced that Emma was murdered.
Chapter 5. Edward knocked back the remainder of his drink in one gulp. Things had taken a darker turn than he'd expected.
What makes you think that? He asked. Because whatever the doctor believes, I fail to understand how or why a woman who favoured her left hand, even though she'd been forced as a child to hold a pen with the right, would inject herself in the left arm. She reverted to her dominant hand unconsciously for most tasks. I haven't been thinking clearly since her illness, but sitting with her body this afternoon, I suddenly realised the error. I even pulled up her sleeve to check for myself, and the mark was quite visible.
Poor, sweet Emma. She may have married his cousin after Edward's rejection, but she'd never been anything but kind to him. He was angry to think someone else might have administered the fatal dose, and, if what Barnabas was saying was true, then he also wanted justice for the woman he'd once been in love with.
Then demand that they hold a second inquest. Barnabas shook his head. And say what? An evil spirit possessed Emma and made her kill herself? Because this Esphere is surely the one who was responsible. Besides, everyone in the household will swear that she was right-handed. Only her parents would have backed me up, and they are both long dead. Our housekeeper spent the night outside her room and swears that no one entered or left from the time I bid my wife good night until the doctor arrived first thing, and I will not countenance that Mrs. Drayton was in any way involved.
But would the spirit of a little girl know how to administer morphia, Barnabas? And even if the spirit did make Emma inject herself, then me contacting them will serve no purpose. Technically, your wife still died by her own hand, and you cannot deliver justice to someone who is no longer alive. Maybe not, Barnabas agreed, but I must know why the little girl acted so. You're my only channel to them, cousin. His voice was sounding increasingly desperate. Help me, and I'll write a cheque for £500 to you this very afternoon in lieu of your stolen inheritance. The shock of this offer put Edward in somewhat of a quandary. It fleetingly occurred to him that he could take this money and make Barnabas pay for the past. He could perform a séance and summon the imaginary spirit of a child called Esphir, claiming she'd stolen the syringe to end her own suffering, and Emma dying had been an unavoidable consequence. Ha! As if a spirit possession was possible. It was far more likely that a living, breathing person had administered that fatal dose. Mrs. Drayton could have fallen asleep. The perpetrator may have accessed the room through a window, or, despite his cousin's declaration, the housekeeper herself may even have been responsible. If he had more time to poke about the house and talk to staff, he could make it quite convincing, get further details regarding Emma's behaviour in the last few days, and, depending how vindictive he was feeling, pass on some condemnatory messages to her husband. Barnabas would certainly believe him, because Edward had spent half his lifetime perpetuating the myth that he could bridge this world and the next. Ever since he was a small child, lonely and isolated, he'd craved attention, and he'd conceived a way to receive it. Starting with simple card tricks and then progressing to more complicated magic, Edward discovered that you could dupe people into believing almost anything, from your ability to turn a woman invisible to sawing off a man's head. And then a stupid comment from a stupid woman about his almost transcendental blue eyes, and the seed had grown. Because he'd wanted to get back at Barnabas for being his father's favourite, he'd convinced his cousin that he could communicate with the dead. It gave him power over the older lad, a boy forced to play with his cousin because Jonah Shaw didn't want his son mixing with other children. But everything Edward did in his capacity as a medium was illusion, sleight of hand, and careful research into the background of his clients, much like his recent summoning of Alfred Temple, the man missing in the treacherous mountains of Tibet. He needed no proof of his death in order to invoke his spirit and give his wife the closure she so badly needed. Alfred's favourite aftershave mixed into the wax of the pillar candle, and Carl extinguishing the flames from behind the scenes, were mere chicanery. It then occurred to Edward that he might be allowing a real person to get away with murder if he blamed this fictional Esphir, but it wasn't his responsibility to seek out justice. Perhaps it would be better to walk away. He'd travelled to Norfolk to save Emma, but, heartbreakingly, had arrived too late. So why was he allowing himself to get sucked into all this nonsense? My answer is still no. Edward rose to his feet, making him appear as powerful as he felt in that moment. You chose not to help me when I was at my lowest ebb, and yet expect me to help you now? All the colour drained from Barnabas's face as he leapt to his feet in his despair and rushed at Edward, gripping his lapels and shunting him backwards. You utter bastard! You're loving this, aren't you? Seeing my pain, my heartache. I've a mind to kill you myself so that you can join her. You always coveted Emma, but I didn't think you could be this cruel. But, like many, he underestimated his cousin's strength, and within a heartbeat, he'd been gripped firmly by the wrists and pinned against the wall. I've had a gut full of your whining, Edward growled. My father chose you over me, left you the house, the business, and much of his wealth. The paltry sum that came my way was small compensation, and you did nothing to redress that, even though the man was dead. You could have involved me in the business I loved, but instead ran it into the ground and gave me not one penny of my birthright. That was the real cruelty. Barnabas was squirming under Edward's painfully tight hold, and he saw a further swell of tears in the older man's eyes. You're right. I thought the money would make me happy, but it didn't.
Take the cheque and the damn house. It's worth another 2,000. Sell it for all I care. These last few days have made me realize that my life is nothing without Emma here to share it with. Contact her spirit and find out who did this, and I'll pass Thistlewick House over to you, I swear it."
Edward released his grip as a tear rolled down his cousin's plump cheek. He could hardly believe the stupid man was prepared to give up so much in a foolish attempt to understand his wife's